The following presentation was made possible by PNC.
Thank you for joining us for this Living St. Louis special, Kids, Race, and Racism. Throughout 9 Network's 66-year history, we've prioritized quality education and well-being for our youngest learners and their families. These times are concerning for all of us, and for our children in particular. The pandemics of racial inequity and COVID-19 require that we redouble our commitment to helping our children make sense of the world around them. On air, online, and in the community, we're committed to racial equity. Tonight, we're having a conversation between parents, children, and all of the St. Louis region. It's not necessarily an easy conversation or one that ends tonight. As a trusted community institution, 9 Network is here with the resources to help you have these ongoing conversations at home. Thank you for joining us tonight.
There's a long, complex, and difficult history of the mistreatment of people because of their race and skin color. This is especially true of Black people in America. The events of 2020, specifically the events following the death of George Floyd, naturally have sparked questions from children. As the mom of a very observant and concerned 8-year-old, I've experienced this firsthand. The truth is, race and the effects of racism are common topics for many families, something that's never not discussed. For others, like mine, knowing how to have that conversation with your kids is new territory, and to do it is a choice. So to be better at talking with my kids about race, I've invited a couple of other moms who just so happen to be brilliant on this topic to guide me, and if you're willing, guide you too. Joining me is Dr. Kira Hudson Banks. She's an associate professor of psychology at St. Louis University. Dr. Banks has a long resume working with diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, including hosting a workshop for parents on this very subject called Raising Equity. Also sharing her wisdom is Maggie Klonsky. Maggie is an educator and the board president of We Stories, an organization that activates previously unengaged white families in St. Louis to view anti-racism as a parenting priority. Thank you for being here tonight. And we're in the middle of a pandemic, so we are outside. We are very far apart from each other. And we're doing this and going through all of this because it's really, really important. And to get us started tonight, to get our discussion going, we're going to hear from the Ward family. They sent us this video. Take a look.
Hi, my name is Patrick. This is my wife Vivian. We have 2 daughters. Harper's 6 and Leah's 4. We live in Caseyville, Illinois.
We both were raised in predominantly African American neighborhoods, so their experiences have been pretty opposite of ours. Their daycare, they were the minority. We discuss all the time just about being kind to everyone and treating everyone respectfully. It doesn't matter what they look like. But we also discuss the times where people will treat you differently because of the way you look. And those conversations are always kind of difficult because you want to educate your children on possible issues that they may come across in school, but you also want to keep their innocence as much as possible.
Harper, who's the 6-year-old, she's probably a little bit more inquisitive, so she asks more questions, and we're really open and honest about how Blacks are viewed, especially with the whole George Floyd situation. That was something that she asked a lot of questions about, and she was really concerned about.
Hi, my name is Harper. Hi, my name is Leah. And I am 6 years old. Our question is, what does race mean and why is it so important? Thank you for having us. Bye!
Okay, well, there's a pretty serious, heavy question. I'm going to throw it to you.
It's serious and heavy, and yet they're precious.
I know.
And so you just want to engage them and share with them, right? I explain race to children of that age that it has to do with our skin tone, and that is melanin. And one way to talk about it for kids of color is that you have a lot of melanin in your skin. And that makes your skin beautiful, right? So you say affirmative things. You help them to understand why people have different skin tones. And at that age, you really want them to understand that in terms of skin tone, that is a difference, but that doesn't mean that we have to treat people differently, right? So I think sometimes we jump to talking to our kids about racism without first talking to them about what is race, skin tone, ethnicity, our background, our culture, our heritage, and give them a foundation in who they are and understanding who they are and being proud of the different parts of who they are. Whether it's you want to talk about their beautiful hair and their curly hair or whatever it is about them that makes them who they are, and your family, whether you focus on your ethnicity, your race, your skin tone, to talk to them about that in an affirmative way. And then once you have that groundwork, then you can start to talk about how, we know that people have different levels of melanin in their skin, and that is part of what makes us all beautiful because we're different, right? But we have a history of making rules that are unfair because of that. And right, so then you can start to layer the unfair systems and the unfair treatment. I think it's important that we do our work before we talk about the systems to help them have a grounding in who they are.
Yeah, so if you're a family and you're, like I'll use myself as an example here. So I know that this is something that me and my husband want to have ongoing dialogue with our two daughters. So is it best to say, here's my plan? Because I'll be honest, earlier this year, my 8-year-old asked me about what was going on, what she was seeing on TV around George Floyd. And I said to myself, I've got it. The door's open. I'm jumping in. And I jumped in and I threw an 800-pound racism block right on her lap, and she cried. I cried. And then I was like, I don't know where to go from here.
I think that's where We Stories comes into play. Like We Stories is an organization that helps you have those conversations before you have to see something on TV and react, right? I mean, wouldn't you say early and often is the best way to have these conversations?
Yeah, that's definitely the approach that we take. We're really heavily based on the research around when bias forms, and the research really heavily supports the fact that formation happens a lot sooner than a lot of people think. I think especially, like, speaking as a white person growing up in the 80s and 90s, it was very common to grow up in a colorblind household. That is a very prevalent attitude among white families, even a lot of white families today. So it's very well intentioned to think when we see others, oh, I don't see color. And what people are intending is to share that they don't want to think of themselves as treating people differently because of their of that person's color, but it's minimizing other people's experiences because of their color. So particularly with We Stories, what we try to do is really start back to that bias formation before the ages of like 7 or 8, if possible. So that's not to say that oh my gosh, your child is 8, like the door is closed, like just toss in the towel. Like, we can always be learning and growing for sure. But the earlier we're able to be proactive and get in front of some of those conversations and start to, I love how you use layering, Kira.
Well, and part of it is also really learning how to talk to your kids about race is unlearning a lot of the things that I grew up as social norms. So it wasn't that my parents sat me down and said, you're not supposed to bring up people's race. That's not what happened. So I remember when my daughter, my oldest, was maybe 2 or 3, and at her daycare, she referred to somebody, the black teacher. And I'll be honest, I was like, oh my God, why is she doing that? Why is she calling out? And that was my reaction. And I even mentioned it to the teachers, and they were like, that's fine. That's fine. That's how she's identifying who somebody is. But I'll be honest, my gut reaction was I was embarrassed. And my daughter's calling out someone's race. And I'm trying to unlearn that recognizing and seeing colors and race and who people are, that's not bad.
Exactly.
That's okay, right?
Exactly. And that what you're saying is that as an adult, you're learning alongside with her, right?
Right.
That and I think that there's a lots of ways in which kids have a tendency to be curious about what's different, and then our shushing of them, our own embarrassment, our own reaction teaches them, and it models for them that this is not okay territory. I shouldn't talk about this, because the research suggests that at about preschool they start to pick up and notice how different people are treated, who's seen as good, bad, pretty. So they notice what we're doing, and I think there are ways in which when they point it out, we get really uncomfortable. And so it's important as adults and as parents to do our own work.
Yeah. When we don't talk about those things because we feel unprepared. So back to your question about preparedness, when we feel like we are a little more like, when we have a little more tools in our tool belts because we've been listening to podcasts and doing our own learning alongside children, then we feel more likely to and more equipped to be able to kind of respond in the moment, or say, let's talk in the car. Like, let's talk about that when we get in the car, if it's going to be something that's going to maybe cause someone harm. Right. But when we don't talk about it, they're extrapolating and filling in the blanks because they're getting racial messages from everywhere.
Right. Let's hear from another family. We visited Will Harpering and his mom, Julie, and she had some interesting things to say. Let's take a look.
My name is Julie Harpering, and this is my son, Will. He's 6 years old. I also have a daughter named Claudia, who's 2, and my husband is Ian. I was of the generation of white middle-class families who grew up not talking about race. And I don't think I'm better for that. There were a lot of things that I didn't learn in history class, and there were things that, even though, my parents were trying to raise us to be anti-racist, maybe didn't necessarily have the tools to really talk openly about it. My husband and I we want to change that narrative for our kids. But I had read information that said that children really young, like 2 and 3 years old, start to notice racial differences and actually start having opinions about people with different skin colors. I think a lot of people are under the impression that kids, especially kids maybe like younger than 10, are just like, oh, they just love everyone. And it's true that a child is not born thinking about people of different races in a different way, but the culture pushes kids toward thinking about people with different skin colors different ways so early, and that's something that we have to counter in our homes starting really young. How do we talk with our kids about racial violence when it comes up in the news? We want to be honest with them, but also keep in mind their emotional and their developmental stages. For Will especially, is the hardest part is answering the question, why do people treat people with skin colors that are different from them badly? And it's hard to come up with an answer for that because we don't understand ourselves.
Okay, wow, she said a lot of things that I think a lot of people can relate to.
I think it's important to share with our kids, racism isn't fair, right? So she asked, how do I talk to my kid about racial violence? How do I explain why people are being treated differently and poorly? I say, we can't explain it. It's wrong. And so we need to understand the history of it, what's happening now, so we can interrupt and change it. And that's where you start to layer the conversation about racism, right? So race in and of itself, yes, it was socially constructed and started because of enslavement of black folks in the United States, and it had that purpose, right?
Before parents do this, should we go back and do a little history lesson ourselves? Because again, like what she said, we weren't taught this. This isn't something that was necessarily, in our history books. And I feel like before I even broach this with my kids, I need to do my own research and be able to understand it and wrap my head around it a little bit better.
I would say yes, and if you are going to wait until you feel like you're all the way ready before you start the conversation with your child might be, having their own children or their own grandchildren, only because
Fair point.
The history is so deep. The the wealth of information is so vast. I think that was one of the reasons why it was kind of great for me to start out when my kids were so young, because I could feel like I was like, okay, I can start off at a simple enough level for a 2 or 3 year old while I'm learning alongside them.
Right. I like that concept of just, I'm going to embrace the fact that I'm going to learn with them.
And share that with your kids. Say, you know what? Own that. There's a lot of this I didn't learn in the schools.
I feel like the pressure's just kind of been lifted off of me sitting here with that idea.
I own that to and now my oldest is now 6. He was 18 months when we started, 15 months, I think. And so we've been able to layer things, and I own that with him. You know, there's a lot that I still don't know yet. And so let's look into that more, or let's find out. This is what I know so far. This is what I've learned since leaving school, and I've learned more recently. But I'm still wondering about X, Y, and Z. Let's look into that.
And I think it's important to have that spirit of being a learner with your kid and being willing to name that we know this is wrong. We don't know how to fix it. My generation hasn't fixed it, but I want to learn with you, because maybe your generation can be the one to fix it. Maybe your generation can be the one to say, you know what, we're not going to have these unfair rules. We're not going to let this happen.
But what about age appropriate? Is that some of that, like she was asking, is that kind of too harsh for young kids?
If they have seen the footage, it's not. So this is the thing. If the kids have access to social media, to YouTube, if they're seeing the images, we have responsibility as parents to help them make sense of what they're seeing. Now, if your kid is not seeing the video or snippets of any sort of police violence, then you can make it a little lighter, a little fluffier, and just talk about people being unfair. But I think with COVID, our kids they're seeing what we're seeing. They're seeing the news, and we have to either completely shield them from it or be responsible if they see it.
Be honest about it. Let's pause here for 1 second. We're going to see another story. This one's from Ruth Zell that talks about a mobile museum that looks to kids for solutions.
So that means you got to use your imagination, huh?
Imagination.
Honestly, the easiest conversations to have around race and racism are with children, because they haven't been molded yet by society, right? So they're not pessimistic yet. They're not. I also think that they're not pointing the finger yet, right? Like, whose fault is it?
It's not common to see the solutions for injustices be placed in the hands of children, but Dr. Amber Johnson sees them as the simplest key for solving these problems by literally placing the tools in their hands. With the Justice Fleet, community members are engaged with tangible exhibits that foster healing of injustices through art, play, and dialogue.
So what we do is we take highly interactive exhibits, and you have to think of exhibits differently from you would like a museum exhibit. It's an experience. And we take them into neighborhoods, and we have them engage in these different activities that are either rooted in art therapy, play therapy, or horticulture therapy, some form of therapeutic activity. And we have conversations that otherwise would be really difficult.
These difficult conversation topics can range from economic injustices, housing security, abuse, equality, and racism. Forgiveness and healing is what Dr. Johnson hopes to accomplish with the Justice Fleet. But another goal is to come up with creative solutions for these heavy issues. And what they're finding is that children could have the answers.
So for instance, radical imagination, we open up this box of toys, we're telling people to start touching stuff and playing. And adults are like, let me write my ideas down first. Let's confer and decide what we want to build first. I'm like, no, just do it. Whereas children, they start immediately. They don't worry about constraints because they don't understand, like, money's not an issue to a child. But if you say, here's a box of toys, how would you fix homelessness in St. Louis City? Ideas fly.
Okay, well, Dr. Johnson said that talking to kids about race and racism are some of the easiest people to talk to, and now I feel like I've underestimated young kids when it comes to this.
Absolutely. Kids are capable. And like I was saying, kids are able to dream up solutions, whereas adults, we're stuck in, as Dr. Johnson said, the constraints of what is. And they are in some ways more capable than we are of thinking about how we interrupt the inequities that we see around us.
I feel like we've regressed as we've become adults in this way.
I want to really just say, people sometimes say, oh, let's keep kids sheltered, they're innocent, and let those people die off, right? And those people would be us as adults.
Right.
Right, if we didn't know.
Well, based on what I'm saying tonight, I think it might be a fair statement.
But here's the thing. Those children, if we are not intentional about teaching them how to understand systems, their role in them, and how to interrupt them, they will become us.
Yeah.
So they're picking up and they're learning all along, and that's why we have to engage them in things like radical imagination to help them keep that I would say, kind of like that muscle to get that strength in interrupting and dreaming, and not become adults that can't see their way out of the problems we've created.
Okay, so you guys at We Stories, you see this with families, with parents and kids, and you probably see the vast difference between the way that kids are looking at things and the way that the parents might be looking at things. Although the parents are choosing to be there, they're on board, but they're unlearning stuff.
Many of the parents feel like they're signing up because they need to do it for their children, and that is true, and they're the ones doing just as much, if not more, learning. It's the whole family is participating in the process. And then they didn't realize like how much they were going to learn and how much it was really going to transform their families. And when I say transform, I mean it has impacted my family in pretty much every way I can imagine, in terms of just like down to the fact that we talk about race on I would say daily basis, like probably multiple times a day, whereas that was not necessarily the case beforehand.
Can I ask you in what way, when you say you're talking about race, is it serious? Is it heavy stuff? Is it just...
No, that's a great question. So I think it's interesting. I forget the way you framed your very first question at the outset, but I remember you said something like the young girl had asked, what is race and why does it matter? Mm-hmm. And I think the way that you asked the question was to Kira was the way that many folks think of it. Wow, that's a heavy question, I think was
maybe because I actually didn't know how to answer it. Like I didn't know how to answer it.
And I think that's the way many, especially white folks, can feel about that question and topic, when actually...
It does, because we're not supposed to talk about it.
Why? Like, why is that a heavy... I mean, there are many reasons why it can be, right? Mm-hmm. But to Kira's point and your point earlier, like race can also be, in and of itself, it can be a positive thing if you're talking about embracing race, not
it's context.
Yeah, it's the context. Yeah. So one big aspect of what we do in We Stories, and one thing I work on in my own home, is like very much the process of decentering whiteness. And so what that means is like when we read books that feature, Black protagonists or other people of color. So if we're reading books or we're watching a TV show or we're patroning a restaurant or, like whatever place of business or whatever we're interacting with, those are all positive interactions. And those are not necessarily related to something negative. Now, do we have we have many books that talk about historical acts of racism, and do we read those and talk about those too? Yes. But if those are the only things we're ever talking about, then that becomes a problem, because then that can become otherizing.
Let me ask, would that be the same for Black families or mixed race families?
And so it is also important, equally important in families of color. And so as in our Black family, to not have the conversation about race and racism always be negative, and that we're a victim and that we're treated poorly, right? And so that's why that foundation of answering the question of who are we, with race and skin tone being a piece of that, is so key. How do we tell the story of our family and the things that they've done and they happen to be Black? Or when we think about like the invention of a light bulb, we think about Edison, right? But what about Latimer, who created the filament to make it accessible to everyone, right? That the conversation about race should not always be about racism, and that we need to think about how those are separate and connected. And for Black families in particular, of course we want our children to understand the history of being enslaved in the United States, but that interrupted our history. That does not equal our history.
Is that a white person problem thing, that we are the ones that are putting race in that negative context?
I don't know if I'd go as far as to say that it's a white person thing, but I think there is a way in which white people often don't see themselves as raced. And so they see other people's race, and when they're forced to see other people's race, it's usually in a negative light. And so that's where the conversation focuses. But that's why, even for white folks, and feel free to jump in, right? It's important to understand, what does race mean to me as a white person? Not just what does race mean to other people, and how is race used in a negative way. The other thing I want to make sure we mention, though, is that for the history of racism and black people in particular in our country and indigenous folks being treated poorly, there were white people who were anti-racist. And I also think that those stories don't get told. And so white people often think of, if we're going to talk about racism, that means it's something that I did negative as a white person. And there is a history of white active anti-racism that I think is important that we all understand, but in particular for white families to understand.
All right, well, we'll wrap this up here. So, but before we wrap up, is there any bit of wisdom you want to leave us with?
My encouragement would be to have the conversation that we can do hard things. So do it, and do it often, and do it in community. So find a community.
Don't do it alone. You don't have to do this alone.
You don't have to do it alone.
How about you? What do you got for us?
Yeah, ditto. And, start early. So don't feel like you have to be an expert before you start. Jump in, learn alongside your child. And it's okay to say, I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to that yet. Let's find out about that.
Well, I'm walking away from this knowing that I don't have to be perfect, that I can learn along with my kids, and I can try. I can try. We can try, right? Well, thank you, Kira, Maggie. I really appreciate your time and your wisdom you shared with us tonight. While making lasting change is complicated and results are not seen overnight, it is possible. And all of us must do our part to make our little corner of the world, the St. Louis region, a more just and equitable place for all, starting by talking to our kids. Thanks for watching. Good night.